We don't produce enough. We are net importers of rice.
Hakuna haja sisi tuwe tunatoa mchele huko Pakistan. Na tuna uwezo hapa Mwea kuzalisha mchele wa kutosha.
Now, do you know that rice is Kenya's third staple food after maize and wheat? And ask yourself, the rice that ends up on your table, where does it come from? Does Kenya produce enough? Is it imported? And what is the quality of that rice? The status of rice farming in Kenya. That is the focus of our show today. Welcome, I'm your host, Alex Chamwada. We bring you this show right from Mwea Irrigation Scheme. We will speak to farmers to hear their stories. What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? What is the way forward?
Lakini hiyo ya kukuja ndio inaharibu bei hapa.
Hizi combine harvester zinafanya kazi haraka.
We will also give you a picture of the rice growing areas in the country.
Main variety grown here is Basmati 370, which is an aromatic variety, commonly referred to as Bishori.
Also in this show, we will get expert view from Dr. James Nyoro, a food security analyst. But first, here is our fact sheet. Rice is a common delicacy on our tables, a staple food for nearly half of the world's population. In Kenya, rice is the third staple food after maize and wheat.
So it's growing at 11% per year, while maize is growing at about 3%. These are consumption figures.
A bigger percentage, that's about 95% of Kenya's rice, is grown under irrigation in the paddy rice schemes across the country. And the bulk of rice produced in Kenya comes from Mwea Irrigation Scheme in Kirinyaga County.
We currently have 7,000 farmers.
The scheme produces about 1 million bags per year. Other rice schemes are Ahero and West Kano Plains in Kisumu County, Pekera in Baringo, Bunyala that cuts across Busia and Siaya counties, and Yala Swamp Irrigation Scheme in Siaya County.
Rice production in Mwea provides approximately 3 direct jobs per acre and 2 indirect jobs per acre.
The biggest threat to Kenya's rice farming lies in imports.
30% is produced locally. So we are importing 70%.
Yet Kenya has the potential to produce enough for herself and even surplus for export. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, Kenya imports nearly all of its rice from the Far East. Other countries Kenya imports rice from include Vietnam, Thailand, Egypt, India, Tanzania, and USA. And this is the history of Mwea Irrigation Scheme.
The scheme was established in early 50s, starting from around 1954, with the labor of the Mau Mau trainees, with an area of about 600 acres initially. And the scheme has since grown to the current 26,000 acres.
Moses and Eunice are a couple. They soil their hands to earn a living in Mwea Irrigation Scheme. The couple is among the 7,000 farmers in Mwea.
Hii mpunga ndio inanisaidia ili nipate mapato, niendeleze maisha ya jamii yangu.
All in all, rice farming has transformed lives in Mwea and contributed to the growth of urban centers like Wanguru town. However, the bitter reality is that while middlemen smile all the way to the bank, farmers who toil in the paddy farms get a raw deal.
Kulima ni kitu ya maana sana, juu ukitia bidii kwa ukulima utapata mapato. Lakini kuna kuanga na changamoto zingine kwa ukulima, juu kama waweza ulima upate price mahali unaenda kuuza hiyo mapato yako, bei iko chini kabisa, na wakati mwingine bei inakuanga sawa.
Rice takes about 4 to 5 months to mature. The farmer eventually may not be paid immediately after selling the produce. but others in the value chain could get instant profits. Farmers may not have a strong voice to influence the value chain to their favor. All depends largely on policymakers and how the policies are implemented and enforced.
Bei inakuanga ni kama constant juu wakati tunavuna inasimamia 5,000. Na kuna wengine wanaitwa brokers huko wanaingianga na 4,000. Au sasa wanavinya watu, na wakulima wengi ni wanauzanga mchere juu wanatarajia wakivuna ndio wanalipa karo za shule, wakivuna ndio wanafanya mambo yao. Hata sasa kama bei itakuwa chini wanahitajika wauze tu.
But what exactly is the role of the farmer here, and what is the role of the National Irrigation Board?
The role of the farmers through their leadership is water distribution, there is dispute resolution, there is maintenance of infrastructure, that's the tertiary infrastructure, the infrastructure at the farm level, the small canals and such than drains. Our role as the National Irrigation Board is maintenance of the primary and secondary infrastructure, like the intake works, the main canals. There's also capacity building, training farmers, linking farmers to markets and such like things. We also do land administration. That's for the trust land, for the gazetted area, which we refer to as the main scheme.
Now, this expansive spread of rice in Mwea may be deceiving, that all is well when it comes to water supply. But that is not the case. There are times when there is water shortage, hence posing yet another threat to rice farming here.
Tukiona kwa hii msimu ama hii season mapato itakuwa down kidogo juu maji ilikosekana. Lakini wakati kuna kuanga na maji mingi, mchele unakuanga kitu poa na mapato inakuanga mingi. Ime affect juu hata mchele huwezi tia fertilizer kama hakuna maji. Na wakati ya kuweed tunafanya weeding na bei kali juu maji ikikosekana na hiyo weed inakuanga mingi zaidi.
As you've heard from farmers there, here in Mwea, one of the challenges they face is that sometimes there is no constant supply of water when they need it. Now, the National Irrigation Board has a plan to construct a dam along River Thiba, the main river that supplies water here. We want to find out how far has that plan reached. Construction of the dam is yet to begin, as at the moment, the process of compensating at least 700 families to be relocated to pave way for the construction of the dam is still ongoing.
We have done compensation about 96%, is remaining about 4%. This 4% consists of families which have got succession issues. The dam that will sit on some 560 acres of land is expected to help expand the area under irrigation and increase crop intensity in the existing scheme. Once completed, it will enable expansion of the irrigation area by 24,000 acres, hence doubling the scheme. It is estimated to cost 16 billion shillings.
Dam hii inaenda kupanua, itaongeza ekari ambazo tunatumia kukuza mchele. Hakuna haja sisi tuwe tunatoa mchele huko Pakistan, na tuna uwezo hapa Mwea kuzalisha mchele wa kutosha.
Despite the challenges, there is a new development in Mwea that is bringing hope. That is mechanization. The government of Kenya has collaborated with the government of Japan in mechanization of rice farming in Mwea in order to enhance efficiency and profitability. The deal is that the machines are acquired at subsidized prices. First, tractors for land preparation.
Wakati tulikuwa tukilima na majembe, eka ilikuwa na bei kali, lakini wakati hii ni rahisi sababu trakta inafanya hata kama ni eka 10 siku moja. lakini wakati ule tulikuwa tunalima tu shamba moja.
Combine harvesters is the latest technology uptake in the scheme, which has saved the farmer up to 4,000 shillings per acre, not to mention the time saved.
Combine harvester inatumia dakika kama 30 hivi, rahisisha kazi na mkulima huwa anatumia pesa kidogo.
Wakati tunatumia manyo kuvuna mpunga, mbegu nyingi zinapotea, zinakuwa shattered, lakini machine inakusanya zote, alafu sasa inakuwa faida kwa mkulima.
Hebu niseme kwa eka moja ilikuwa inatoka 25 bags, lakini kikatwa na rice combine harvester unakuta umepata 28 au 30.
Now, this weed is called nylon weed, or in Kikuyu, dawani. It's a very dangerous weed. It looks like rice, and removing it can be quite tedious. You can see it's a manual process. And that's where we take a quick lunch break. When we return, we will be joined by food security analyst, Dr. James Nyoro. Don't go away. The first question we would want to ask is, what is the status of rice production in Kenya?
Thank you. As you know, rice is the third most important cereal commodity, maize being first and then wheat. So rice is so important to the extent that actually it's growing the fastest in terms of consumption because of urbanization, because of changing eating habits. So it's growing at 11% per year. Well, maize is growing at about 3%. These are consumption figures, and wheat is growing actually at 6%. So wheat and rice are two important commodities that will increasingly be displacing maize going into the future. We don't produce enough. We are net importers of rice. Our production is just about, actually it has gotten to about 150,000 tons. It has always been below 100,000 tons, but the last 3 or so years has seen some changes. So our production is just about 150,000 tons. Our consumption is in excess of 600,000 tons. They say between 550 and 600. As you can see, a deficit of 400,000 tons.
And what's the reason for that gap? Is it because Kenya has not put in place the right policies, the right mechanism to produce the rice? Why that situation?
Most of the rice that we produce is what we call the paddy rice. Increasingly in Africa, they've been moving towards the hybrid rice.
Paddy rice means what?
Paddy rice is the one that you have to do, you have to flood it with water. The kind of thing that you see in where rice production is underwater, okay? So you require a lot of water, you require to do a lot of dams, whereas now increasingly, and in other parts of Africa, including Nigeria and Ghana and so on, they've started to do hybrid rice, which means you don't have to put it underwater. It's not water flooded. So that's, but in Kenya, about close to 90% of our rice is paddy rice. Now, paddy rice in Kenya has largely been produced in Mwea, in Ahero, West Kano, Bunyana, and to some extent Yara Swamp. Now, largely small scale, it's not large scale. The mechanization has been very rudimentary. If you go to where there has been changes, the ministry has done quite a lot. The government has done quite a lot over the last 1-2 years in terms of mechanization. But our mechanization has been extremely poor, to the extent that sometimes you have ox plowing the flooded fields. You can imagine how difficult that one is. Weeding has been very mechanical. Harvesting has been mechanical. Thrashing has been mechanical. Everything including processing. So our technology has been very rudimentary, to the extent that then you cannot talk about economies of scale. We also have we've not been able to harvest a lot of water. The main complaint today in Mwea is whether we have adequate water, even to flood the fields that are existing. Because we need to do dams. You need to do the dams. So the technology of harvesting water, the technology of producing rice, the technology of whether we are doing small scale or large scale, which is what large scale is what is done all over the world, that is where we've been having constraints in this country, hence the raw production.
So it means we have great potential to produce more rice.
We have a huge potential. The 150 that we talked about, a big proportion of it is coming from where? Ahero and Bunyara and West Kano can produce almost 3 times or 4 times what they are doing today. So we can very quickly, looking at the small scale irrigation schemes that we are talking about, we can move up to about 450 very quickly if we can mechanize, if we can provide more water, which can be done within 1 or 2 years, hence reducing the import to about 100. But we also have huge potential for large scale rice production. There was a lot of discussion on rice production in the Tana Delta. There are issues with Tana Delta because of biodiversity and all of that. But Kenya as a country must consider that we have to think about our food security. Garana, there was some land that was to be put at a large scale rice production. So we haven't moved into large scale rice production. So what I'm saying is, if we concentrate on the small irrigation schemes that we are having, we could very easily reach 450. And the balance, we can now start to move to large-scale rice production.
Are there any policies between, for example, Kenya and the Pakistani government that inform this situation where we import so much from Pakistan?
Sometimes we bring in at a time when we are harvesting and therefore depressing the domestic prices. We mainly produce basmati rice. We are now increasingly producing a bit of pishori rice. And part of that problem of regulating imports is a Kenya problem. The problem of knowing when the imports come in so that they don't create disincentives to our domestic production. If you look at the agreement on COMESA on rice, our agreement with the countries within the region has been that you impose a 75% tax on imports so that you encourage domestic production. Other countries, actually there's rice that is coming in from Tanzania and others, not necessarily their own production, but also from import. Now the problem we've been having is that a lot of our rice is imported from Pakistan. Now when within the COMESA there was the agreement of the 75% duty, Pakistan, who import our tea, came up in arms and they said, no, we have to reciprocate that we zero rate the imports because they zero rate our tea imports. And there has been issues on that. So within the COMESA, there's a safeguard for Kenya to charge only 35% instead of 75% so that we can reciprocate our trade with Pakistan on tea. Now, that in itself hurts our production because you make the imports cheaper, but obviously it allows the export of tea. Again, going into, should we start to think about diversifying our tea markets so that we are not being penalized by only one importer? So there has been issues even in terms of tariffs, which will have implications on domestic production.
And what is the role of the private sector?
There are 2 ways of looking at the private sector. The first one is, as I said, over the last 1 year, there has been huge mechanization of Mwea rice production. If you go to Mwea today, they are doing rice preparation in a much more mechanized way, even in terms of harvesting, threshing. There has been a beehive of activity now in Mwea because the private sector with the government is coming in and introducing these technologies much more faster. Now, if you talk about large-scale production, because largely the small irrigation schemes are run by government, by NIB, where is largely run by NIB, the private sector investors have not come in. And therefore, if you start to talk about what do we do in Yara, there used to be a private sector investment there, and then it was politicized, if you can remember, with even the county government going in requesting for certain cash requirements and so on. So we need to provide a very clear signal to the private sector to be able to invest. If we talk about producing rice in the Tana Delta, it's not a government project, it's not NIB, it is essentially the role of the private sector with government providing the basic infrastructure, which is basically providing the water, the damming, and all of that, and then the private sector will come into production. Processing right now is done largely by the private sector. If you go to Mwea, you will see along the Mwea Embu Road, you see a beehive of activity where private sector processors and even wholesalers and retailers have come in. Even equally, if you go to the supermarkets, you start to see very high quality rice that was not there, although most of it is imported and repackaged here, but they are also repackaging the rice from Mwea and other irrigation schemes. So the private sector is responding to the extent that we are providing the necessary conducive environment for them to invest.
So are there any competing interests that maybe could jeopardize the business or the production, for example, between the private and the government sector?
You know, I think one of the things, Alex, we need to consider in Kenya is that we are probably thinking too much about regulating almost everything. Where our agriculture sector is, it does not require more regulation. It requires the government and the private sector sitting down and agreeing on what the role of government is. A PPP. The government comes in and say, for us to produce 100,000 acres of rice in Tana Delta, we as government have given an undertaking to provide the basic infrastructure, which is the dams, opening up the paddies, the roads, the energy and so on. And you as the private investor come in and start producing. And if you start producing, then our policy, that's the only part of the policy and regulatory on imports, so that you don't then bring in imports at a time when the production has come into place.
That's where we end today's show. We spent time with farmers in Mwea, the pearl of rice growing in Kenya. We examined the status of rice farming in Kenya and the source of what ends up on your table. We are glad you watched this show, and until we meet again next week, on behalf of the crew, bye-bye for now.